The morning air felt crisp as Princess Anne stepped out of her silver Land Rover at the charity event venue. She had arrived early, as was her custom, to review the schedule and meet with organizers before the crowds gathered. The weather forecast had mentioned possible rain, but the princess paid little attention to such warnings. She had attended thousands of events in all kinds of weather. Black pulled up just as Anne was greeting the first group of volunteers. The queen consort emerged wearing an elegant cream coat and her signature pearl necklace. She smiled warmly at the photographers who had already positioned themselves near the entrance, their cameras ready to capture every moment of the royal visit. The two women exchanged polite nods as they entered the community center together. Anne noticed that seemed particularly animated today, chatting extensively with the event coordinators and making sure the photographers captured her interactions with the local children who had gathered to present flowers. Inside the building, the atmosphere buzzed with excitement. Local dignitaries, charity workers, and community leaders had all dressed in their finest clothes for this special occasion. The event was meant to raise awareness for a children's literacy program, something both royals had supported in their own ways over the years. Anne moved efficiently through her scheduled meetings, discussing fundraising goals with the charity directors and reviewing the new reading programs they had developed. She had always preferred the working aspects of royal duties over the ceremonial ones. Her approach was direct and practical, asking detailed questions about budgets, timelines, and measurable outcomes. Meanwhile, held court in the main hall, surrounded by admirers and local officials. She spoke eloquently about the importance of early childhood education, her voice carrying easily across the room. Several times, Anne noticed how positioned herself perfectly for the photographers, ensuring every angle captured her engagement with the cause. As the morning progressed, dark clouds began gathering outside the large windows. The wind picked up, rattling the glass panes and causing some of the decorative banners to flutter wildly. A few of the older attendees glanced nervously at the sky, but the indoor festivities continued without interruption. The formal presentation began at 11 o'clock sharp. Anne took their places on the small stage that had been erected for the occasion. The charity chairwoman introduced them both, highlighting their long-standing commitment to education and children's welfare. Anne's introduction was brief and focused on her decades of hands-on charity work. This introduction lasted considerably longer, emphasizing her role as queen consort and her expanding influence on national causes. During the presentations, Anne noticed checking her phone several times. It seemed unusual, as royal protocol typically discouraged such behavior during official events. When Anne glanced at the screen during one of these moments, she caught sight of several text messages, though she couldn't read their contents from her position. The children's choir performed beautifully, their young voices filling the hall with traditional songs. Anne found herself genuinely moved by their enthusiasm and preparation. She had always connected well with young people, appreciating their honesty and energy. Applauded warmly but seemed somewhat distracted, her eyes occasionally drifting toward the windows where the storm clouds were becoming increasingly ominous. After the formal ceremonies concluded, both royals were scheduled to tour the facility's new library and computer center. The tour was meant to last 45 minutes, giving them time to interact with more children and see the programs in action. Anne looked forward to this part of the visit, as she genuinely enjoyed observing educational initiatives firsthand. As they moved through the hallways, Anne noticed that kept glancing at her watch. When they reached the computer lab, where a group of 8-year-olds were learning basic coding skills, his phone buzzed again. This time, she excused herself briefly to check the message, stepping just outside the room's doorway. The children were eager to demonstrate their projects, and Anne became absorbed in their explanations of the simple games and animations they had created. She asked thoughtful questions about their favorite subjects and what they hoped to learn next. Her genuine interest was obvious, and the young programmers responded with increasing confidence and excitement. When returned, she seemed agitated. She whispered something to her private secretary, who had been following discreetly behind them throughout the tour. Anne caught fragments of their conversation, hearing mentions of schedule changes and urgent matters, but she continued focusing on the children's presentations. The final stop on the tour was the new reading garden, an outdoor space where children could enjoy books in a natural setting. As they approached the exit to the garden, the first drops of rain began falling against the windows. The patter was light at first, but within minutes, the drops grew larger and more frequent. The garden coordinator, an enthusiastic teacher named Mrs. Henderson, had prepared a special demonstration of how the outdoor reading program worked. She had arranged for several children to be waiting in the garden with their favorite books, ready to show the visiting royals how they used the space for both individual reading and group storytelling sessions. Anne looked out at the gathering storm and then at the eager faces of the children who had been waiting outside. "We should still go out," she said firmly. "A little rain won't hurt us, and these children have prepared something special." Hesitated, glancing again at her phone. "Perhaps we could postpone this portion. The weather seems quite unpredictable." Mrs. Henderson looked disappointed but tried to hide it professionally. "Of course, Your Majesty, we could arrange for the children to come inside instead." Anne shook her head. "No need. I'd like to see the garden as it was intended to be experienced." She turned to, "You're welcome to wait inside if you prefer." The Queen Consort's phone buzzed again, and this time she answered it immediately. Her conversation was brief but intense, and when she finished, her expression had changed completely. "I'm terribly sorry," she announced to the group, "but I've just received word of an urgent matter that requires my immediate attention. I'll need to leave right away." Anne studied his face, noting the tension that hadn't been there earlier. "Nothing serious, I hope." "Family business," replied vaguely, already signaling to her security detail. "I'm afraid I'll have to cut my visit short. Please give my apologies to everyone." Within minutes, and her entourage were moving quickly toward the exit. Anne watched them go, puzzled by the sudden departure but not entirely surprised. Royal schedules were often subject to unexpected changes, though something about manner suggested this was more than a routine adjustment. The rain was now falling steadily, creating a rhythmic drumming against the building's roof. Mrs. Henderson approached Anne hesitantly. "Ma'am, would you still like to visit the garden? We could certainly wait until the weather improves." Anne looked out at the children who were still waiting patiently under the covered pavilion in the garden. They had clearly been there for some time, and their excitement about sharing their reading space remained evident despite the rain. Some held books protectively under their jackets, while others had brought small umbrellas. "Absolutely," Anne said without hesitation. "Let's not keep them waiting any longer." She stepped outside into the rain, immediately feeling the cold drops on her face and hands. Her practical wool coat provided some protection, but within moments, her hair began to dampen and cling to her forehead. The children cheered when they saw her approaching, their enthusiasm undimmed by the weather. Anne spent the next 20 minutes in the garden, moving from child to child as they shared their favorite books and reading spots. She sat on wet benches, knelt on damp grass, and listened intently as young voices read aloud passages from adventure stories and fairy tales. The rain continued falling, but her attention remained completely focused on the children and their obvious love for reading. By the time the garden tour concluded, Anne was thoroughly soaked. Her coat hung heavy with water, and her usually neat hair had become disheveled by the wind and rain. But her spirits remained high, energized by the genuine enthusiasm of the children and the meaningful nature of the program she had just witnessed. As she made her way back toward the building, Anne noticed that Scar was indeed gone. The Queen Consort had left during the garden visit, taking her entire retinue with her. Anne's own security detail had remained, of course, but they seemed somewhat bewildered by the change in plans. Inside the building, Mrs. Henderson and the other staff members rushed to provide towels and hot tea. Anne accepted both gratefully, though she downplayed the significance of getting caught in the rain. "Perfectly normal British weather," she said with a smile. "I've certainly been in worse conditions." The event coordinators were clearly concerned about the abrupt change in the royal visit's conclusion. They had planned for both royals to participate in a final ceremony and group photograph, and sudden departure had left them scrambling to adjust their arrangements. Anne did her best to minimize any awkwardness caused by the situation. She participated enthusiastically in the closing ceremony, delivered impromptu remarks about the importance of the literacy program, and posed for photographs with the children, staff, and volunteers. Her clothes were still damp, and her hair remained slightly disheveled, but her warm demeanor and genuine engagement helped salvage what could have been an awkward conclusion to the event. As she prepared to leave, Anne reflected on the morning's events. Sudden departure seemed unusual, even for someone with a busy royal schedule. The timing, coinciding with the arrival of the rain and the outdoor portion of the visit, struck Anne as particularly odd. She had known for many years now, through all the complexities of her relationship with Charles and her integration into the royal family, but this behavior felt different somehow. Her driver brought the Land Rover to the front entrance, and Anne said her final goodbyes to the event organizers. They thanked her profusely for staying despite the weather and assured her that the children would never forget her willingness to join them in the rain. As she settled into the passenger seat, Anne realized that her clothes were still quite wet, but the warmth of the children's enthusiasm had made the discomfort worthwhile. Charles had been reviewing diplomatic briefings in his study at Clarence House when his private secretary knocked urgently on the door. The morning had been proceeding normally, with the usual stack of government papers, correspondence from various Commonwealth nations, and preparations for upcoming state visits demanding his attention. "Your Majesty," his secretary began hesitantly, "we've received some concerning reports about this morning's charity event." Charles looked up from the briefing papers scattered across his mahogany desk. He had been aware that both Anne and were attending the literacy event together, something that had been planned weeks in advance. Such joint appearances had become more common as the royal family worked to present a united front in their charitable endeavors. "What sort of reports?" he asked, setting down his reading glasses. The secretary consulted his notes carefully. "It appears the Queen Consort left the event quite suddenly, while Princess Anne remained and continued with the scheduled activities despite deteriorating weather conditions." Charles frowned, had mentioned nothing about any changes to her schedule when they had spoken briefly over breakfast that morning. She had seemed in good spirits, looking forward to the event and particularly excited about meeting the children who would be presenting their reading projects. "Did mention why she left early?" Charles inquired. "The official explanation was urgent family business, sir. However, our advance team is reporting that Princess Anne was left to complete the outdoor portion of the visit alone, in rather heavy rain, while the Queen Consort departed in her car." The implications of this situation began to dawn on Charles immediately. Royal visits were carefully choreographed affairs, and early departures by senior family members were unusual unless genuine emergencies arose. More concerning was the image of Anne being left alone in the rain while departed in comfort and safety. Charles reached for his phone to call directly, but his secretary cleared his throat diplomatically. "Sir, we've been unable to reach the Queen Consort's team for the past hour. Her car seems to have gone directly to a private appointment that wasn't on the official schedule." This information puzzled Charles even more. His diary was typically managed with precision, and unscheduled appointments were rare, especially during official royal duties. He wondered what could have been important enough to warrant such an abrupt departure from a planned engagement. "Have we heard anything from Anne's team?" he asked. "Princess Anne completed the full schedule as planned, sir. She spent considerable time with the children in their outdoor reading garden despite the rain. The event organizers were apparently very grateful for her dedication, though they seemed surprised by the change in arrangements." Charles felt a familiar tension building in his shoulders. Throughout his long relationship with, he had worked hard to ensure her acceptance within the family and among the public. Anne, for her part, had always been professional in her interactions with, even if their relationship remained somewhat formal rather than genuinely warm. He decided to try reaching again, dialing her direct number. The call went straight to voicemail, which was unusual during working hours. Typically kept her phone accessible during royal duties in case of coordination needs or emergencies. "Sir," his secretary continued, "there's another matter. The press photographers at the event captured images of Princess Anne conducting the garden tour alone in the rain. Some of these photos are already appearing on social media, and the palace press office is fielding questions about the Queen Consort's early departure." Charles rubbed his temples, recognizing the potential public relations implications. The contrast between leaving in a dry car and Anne staying to fulfill her duties in the rain could easily be interpreted unfavorably, regardless of the actual circumstances behind his departure. "What's the current weather situation at the event location?" Charles asked. "Quite severe, sir. Heavy rain and wind. Princess Anne apparently got thoroughly soaked but insisted on completing all scheduled interactions with the children and staff." The image of Anne, always dutiful and practical, standing in the rain while drove away in comfort troubled Charles deeply. He knew Anne well enough to understand that she would never complain publicly about such a situation, but he also knew that her opinion of, already somewhat reserved, would not be improved by this incident. Charles attempted to call Anne's private secretary to get a first-hand account of events, but was told that the princess was still at the venue, conducting final meetings with the charity organizers. The dedication was typical of Anne, who had always taken her royal duties seriously and rarely cut corners, even when circumstances made her job more difficult. By now, Charles was growing genuinely concerned about what had prompted sudden departure. Family emergencies were always possible, but her failure to communicate with him about the situation seemed odd. They had established patterns of keeping each other informed about schedule changes, especially when such changes might reflect poorly on the royal family's image. He decided to call his son William to see if there might have been any family issues he wasn't aware of. William answered on the second ring, speaking from his office at Kensington Palace, where he was reviewing plans for an upcoming environmental summit. "Father, good morning. How are things?" "William, I'm trying to reach your stepmother about an event this morning. Have there been any family emergencies I should know about?" "Not that I'm aware of," William replied, sounding puzzled. "Is everything all right?" Charles explained the situation briefly, describing sudden departure and Anne's continuation of the event in the rain. William listened carefully, and Charles could hear him typing, presumably looking up news coverage of the event online. "I'm seeing some photos online already," William said after a moment. "Anne looks quite soaked but smiling with the children. There's no mention of where went or why she left." "That's what concerns me," Charles admitted. "It's not like her to leave without proper coordination, and she's not responding to calls." William suggested that perhaps had received news about her own family that required immediate attention. Her children were important to her, and Charles knew she would drop everything if they needed her help. But even in such circumstances, she would typically find a way to communicate the situation to relevant staff. After ending the call with William, Charles found himself packing around his study, unable to concentrate on the diplomatic papers that still awaited his attention. The morning's events were creating exactly the kind of situation he had always hoped to avoid, where family dynamics intersected with royal duties in potentially damaging ways. His press secretary called to report that media interest in the story was growing. Several news outlets were already crafting narratives about the contrast between departure and Anne's dedication. The palace would need to provide some explanation soon, but without knowing actual whereabouts or reasons for leaving, crafting an appropriate response was challenging. Charles decided to drive to the charity event location himself. If Anne was still there, he could at least ensure she had appropriate support for her return journey and perhaps gather a more complete understanding of what had transpired. The drive would also give him time to think about how to handle the situation when he finally did reach. His security detail quickly arranged for the journey, though they pointed out that arriving at the scene might draw even more media attention to the story. Charles weighed this risk against his desire to support Anne and demonstrate that the royal family stood behind the charitable cause, regardless of the morning's complications. As his car pulled away from Clarence's house, Charles reflected on the delicate balance he had always tried to maintain between his loyalty to and his responsibilities to the broader royal family. Anne had never made things difficult regarding his marriage, but she had also never pretended to be closer to than their professional relationship actually warranted. The drive through London's rain-soaked streets gave Charles time to consider various explanations for his behavior. Perhaps there had been a genuine emergency that she felt unable to discuss immediately. Perhaps she had received disturbing news that required her immediate presence elsewhere. Or perhaps there had been a miscommunication about the schedule that had led to the awkward departure. His phone rang during the journey, and Charles hoped it might be finally returning his calls. Instead, it was his private secretary reporting that media speculation about the incident was intensifying. Royal correspondents were already beginning to frame the story as a tale of two different approaches to duty, contrasting Anne's steadfast commitment with questions about its priorities. Charles instructed his press office to prepare a simple statement acknowledging that the Queen Consort had been called away by an urgent personal matter, while emphasizing the success of the charity event and Princess Anne's excellent work with the children and organizers. It was a standard approach to managing royal schedule changes, though Charles knew that the visual impact of the contrasting images would be difficult to counter with words alone. As his car approached the charity venue, Charles could see that media presence had indeed increased since the morning. Several news vans were parked outside, and photographers with long-range lenses were positioned to capture any additional developments. Anne's Land Rover was still in the parking area, suggesting she was indeed still inside the building. Charles felt a growing sense of urgency about reaching the venue. Every minute that passed without explanation was another minute for speculation and potentially damaging narratives to develop. More importantly, he wanted to personally ensure that Anne received appropriate recognition for her handling of a difficult situation. The rain was still falling heavily as Charles's car pulled up to the venue entrance. He could see through the windows that Anne was engaged in what appeared to be a final round of conversations with the event organizers. Her hair had dried somewhat, but her clothes still showed signs of her time in the rain earlier that morning. As Charles prepared to enter the building, he realized that his arrival might be interpreted as either damage control or as a demonstration of support for the charitable cause. Either way, he was committed to ensuring that the morning's events did not overshadow the important work being done by the literacy program or diminish the positive impact of Anne's dedication to seeing the event through to completion. He stepped out of his car into the rain, immediately understanding what Anne had experienced earlier. The downpour was indeed significant, and Charles found himself impressed once again by his sister's practical approach to royal duty. She had clearly prioritized the children and the cause over her own comfort, a choice that reflected the best traditions of royal service. Anne looked up in surprise when Charles entered the community center, his coat dripping from the brief walk from his car to the entrance. The event organizers immediately became flustered, not having expected the king to arrive unannounced at what was supposed to be a routine charity visit. "Charles," Anne said simply, rising from her chair where she had been reviewing the charity's annual report with the director. "What brings you here?" Charles noticed that Anne's clothes, while no longer soaking wet, still bore the evidence of her time in the rain earlier. Her practical approach to the situation was evident in the way she had simply carried on with her duties without making any fuss about her dampened appearance. "I heard about the change in plans this morning," he replied carefully, aware that staff members and volunteers were watching their exchange with great interest. "I wanted to see the excellent work being done here for myself." Anne studied her brother's face, reading the concern and slight embarrassment in his expression. She had known him long enough to recognize when he was managing a delicate situation, and she suspected his sudden appearance was more about damage control than genuine interest in childhood literacy programs. Mrs. Henderson, the enthusiastic teacher who had coordinated the reading garden tour, approached them both with barely contained excitement. "Your Majesty, how wonderful that you could join us. Princess Anne has been absolutely marvelous with the children. They were so thrilled that she stayed for the entire garden program despite the weather." Charles glanced at Anne, nodding her slight smile at the teacher's obvious admiration. "I'm not surprised," he said warmly. "My sister has never been one to let a little rain interfere with her duties." The comment was meant as a compliment, but Anne heard the underlying implication about his departure. She chose not to respond directly, instead focusing on introducing Charles to the key staff members and explaining the various literacy programs they had developed. As they toured the facility together, Charles found himself genuinely impressed by the scope and quality of the educational initiatives. The children's enthusiasm was infectious, and their obvious pride in showing off their reading achievements reminded him why these royal visits mattered beyond their ceremonial value. In the computer lab, a young boy named eagerly demonstrated the coding project he had been working on when Anne visited earlier. "Princess Anne said my game was very clever," he announced proudly. "She asked me lots of questions about how I made the character jump over the obstacles." Charles watched Anne's interaction with, nodding her natural ability to connect with children and her genuine interest in their work. It occurred to him that while was certainly capable in her royal role, Anne's approach to these duties was more instinctive and less performed. When they reached the new library section, Anne showed Charles the collection of books that had been donated through various royal patronages. "They've managed to create something quite special here," she explained. The combination of traditional reading programs with modern technology seems to be working well for children with different learning styles. Charles nodded, but his attention was partially divided by his phone, which had been buzzing intermittently with messages from his staff. He still had not heard directly from, and the media attention surrounding the morning's events was continuing to grow. "Sir," one of his security officers approached discreetly, "your private secretary is requesting a brief word when convenient." Anne noticed the interruption and suggested they step into the small office that Mrs. Henderson had made available for their use. Once they were alone, Charles's facade of calm began to show cracks. "Anne, I need to ask you about this morning," he began. "What exactly happened with—" Anne settled into one of the children's reading chairs, which was comically small for her frame, but seemed appropriate for the honest conversation that was clearly needed. She received several phone calls throughout the morning. She seemed distracted and kept checking the time. When we were about to go outside for the garden tour, she announced that she had urgent family business and left immediately. Did she seem upset, worried about something specific? Anne considered her response carefully. She seemed eager to leave. The phone calls appeared to be the catalyst, but her demeanor suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with the outdoor portion of the visit from the beginning. Charles felt a familiar protective instinct regarding, but he also recognized that Anne was being diplomatically honest about what she had observed. The rain was quite heavy by then. "Yes, it was," Anne agreed. "But the children had been waiting in the garden for over an hour. They had prepared readings and wanted to show us their favorite spots. It seemed important to honor their efforts." The simple statement carried an implicit criticism that Charles could not ignore. Anne's commitment to completing the scheduled activities, regardless of personal discomfort, highlighted the contrast with his departure in a way that no amount of royal protocol could smooth over. "Have you heard from her since she left?" Anne asked. "No," Charles admitted. "She's not responding to calls, and her staff doesn't know where she went after leaving here." Anne raised an eyebrow. In her experience, royal family members did not simply disappear during official duties without maintaining some form of communication with the palace. The situation was becoming more puzzling rather than less so. Charles's phone rang, and he glanced at the screen hopefully. Instead of it was William calling back with an update on the media coverage. Charles answered briefly, speaking in low tones while Anne pretended to examine the children's artwork displayed on the office walls. "That was William," Charles explained after ending the call. "The story is gaining traction online. Some outlets are already running headlines about royal duty and commitment, using photos of you in the rain." Anne sighed. "That's unfortunate. The focus should be on the literacy program, not on our personal dynamics." "Unfortunately, that's not how these things work," Charles replied grimly. "The contrast between you staying and leaving is exactly the kind of narrative that royal correspondents find irresistible." They were interrupted by a knock on the door. Mrs. Henderson peered in hopefully. "I'm so sorry to disturb you, but the children from the garden group have prepared a special thank you presentation for Princess Anne. They were wondering if they might share it before you need to leave." Anne looked at Charles, who nodded immediately. "Of course," Anne replied. "We'd be honored to see what they've prepared." The main hall had been rearranged with chairs in a semicircle, and about 20 children aged 7 to 10 were waiting with obvious excitement. They had changed out of their rain-dampened clothes from the garden session and were now wearing their best outfits, clearly having planned this presentation as a surprise. The young programmer from earlier served as the master of ceremonies. "We wanted to say thank you to Princess Anne for coming to our reading garden even though it was raining," he announced. "She said that a little water never hurt anyone and that she wanted to see our special places no matter what." The children then took turns reading short poems and stories they had written about courage, determination, and the importance of keeping promises. Each piece was clearly inspired by Anne's decision to continue with the outdoor portion of the visit despite the weather. Their words were simple but heartfelt, and their obvious admiration for Anne was touching. Charles found himself moved by the children's presentations, but also increasingly aware of how the morning's events would be perceived by the public. The children had created a narrative about royal duty and commitment that perfectly encapsulated what many people expected from their royal family, but which also implicitly criticized departure. When the presentations concluded, Anne thanked the children warmly and spent several more minutes answering their questions about royal life and her various charitable interests. Her natural ease with young people was evident, and Charles could see why the event organizers had been so pleased with her handling of the visit. As they prepared to leave, Charles's phone finally rang with the call he had been waiting for. His name appeared on the screen, and he answered immediately while stepping into the corridor for privacy. "Darling, I've been trying to reach you," he said, relief evident in his voice. "I'm so sorry, Charles." His voice sounded strained. "I had to deal with a family emergency. Tom called this morning with some very concerning news about his daughter's health situation, and I needed to go to the hospital immediately." Charles felt a complex mix of relief and frustration. A genuine family medical emergency would certainly justify sudden departure, but her failure to communicate the situation earlier had created unnecessary complications and public relations challenges. "Is everything all right now?" he asked. "Still uncertain but stable for the moment," replied. "I realized afterward that I should have found a way to explain the situation before leaving, but I was quite upset and not thinking clearly about protocol." Charles understood the emotional response to family medical crises, but he also knew that the damage to her public image had already been done. The photos of Anne in the rain, combined with unexplained departure, would be difficult to counter even with a legitimate explanation. "Where are you now?" he asked. "Still at the hospital. I probably shouldn't come home for several more hours, depending on how things develop here." Charles explained that he was at the charity venue with Anne, and that media attention to the morning's events was growing. Listened quietly as he described the children's presentations and Anne's graceful handling of the entire situation. "I feel terrible about leaving Anne alone in the rain," said. "She must think very poorly of my behavior." "She handled everything beautifully," Charles assured her. "But yes, the optics are challenging." When Charles returned to the main hall, Anne was saying her final goodbyes to the children and staff. She had signed several books for the library and promised to send additional reading materials from her own charitable foundations. Her genuine warmth and commitment had clearly made a lasting impression on everyone present. "Everything resolved?" Anne asked quietly as they walked toward the exit together. "Family medical emergency," Charles explained briefly. "Tom's daughter." Anne nodded, her expression softening slightly. She had always been understanding about genuine family crises, having dealt with her fair share of medical emergencies involving her own children and over the years. "That explains the urgency," she said, "though perhaps not the communication breakdown." Charles appreciated Anne's measured response. She was not excusing his handling of the situation, but she was acknowledging that family emergencies could create confusion and poor decision-making. As they stepped outside into the continuing rain, Charles realized that his arrival, while well-intentioned, might actually add another layer to the media narrative. His presence could be interpreted as either support for the charitable cause or an attempt to manage the story created by his departure. "Would you like to share a car back?" Charles offered. "Thank you, but I'll take my own vehicle," Anne replied. "I have another appointment this afternoon, and I suspect you have phone calls to make." Charles smiled ruefully. Anne's practical nature extended to understanding the political realities of royal life. She knew that he would need to coordinate with the press office to manage the story, and that her presence might complicate those discussions. As Anne climbed into her Land Rover, Charles reflected on the morning's events. A simple joint charity visit had evolved into a complex situation involving family loyalty, royal duty, public perception, and media management. Despite legitimate reasons for leaving, the lasting image would be Anne standing in the rain with the children while the Queen Consort drove away in comfort. The drive back to Clarence's house gave Charles time to consider how to move forward. The immediate priority was supporting through her family crisis, while also ensuring that the charitable cause did not suffer from the morning's complications. Longer term, the incident highlighted ongoing challenges in balancing personal needs with royal responsibilities, issues that seemed to arise more frequently as the family aged and their personal obligations became more complex. By the time Charles reached home, news outlets were already running stories about the morning's events. The headlines focused on Anne's dedication and raised questions about its priorities. Even with the explanation of a family emergency, The visual narrative of commitment versus convenience had already taken hold in the public imagination. Charles realized that this incident, like so many royal family moments, would become part of the ongoing story about duty, family, and the prices paid for public service.